You have to create the space. That's something that I have been learning, and it's something that I've been convicted about this morning while reading through Deuteronomy chapters 5 and 6. You have to create the space. It won't happen incidentally. It won't happen accidentally. You have to intentionally move to create space. But the question is, create space for what? Like, creating space is great, but there has to be something that we are intentionally putting into the space we are creating. I mean, what are we creating space for more distractions on our phone? Are we creating space for more Netflix shows? Are we creating space for another piece of furniture? Like, what are we creating space for? So let me add on to my exhortation. Let me add on to my sentence. We have to intentionally create space to remember the story before the story. To remember the past, to remember where we have come from, for what events have flowed into this particular moment, so that we will know how to take the next step into the future, into the unfolding portion of the story. What am I talking about? Well, Deuteronomy chapter 5 and 6 is the one that was teaching me this. I'm reading Deuteronomy 5, which is the 10 Commandments, and I'm thinking, oh my goodness, God is exhorting us to create space to remember the story before the story. I mean, this was a powerful moment. It even says in chapter 5, verse 1 of Deuteronomy, Moses summoned all of Israel and said, "Hear Israel, the decrees and laws I declare in your hearing today." He's talking about this moment, this glorious moment, this unique moment where God is going to unveil his law, which is actually something that was a gift of grace. As a matter of fact, in my notes, I have a prayer from the time of Babylon that you have people crying out, asking this God, the father's son is wounded, the father's son is ill, and he's asking this God, please, if I've done anything to offend you, please forgive me. This God, if I've done anything to forgive you, please forgive me. The problem is he doesn't know which God is mad and what it is that they require. But here in chapter 5 of Deuteronomy, we see what God requires. He doesn't force us to shoot in the dark. He doesn't make us guess. He meets us in our space, and he actually begins to reveal his identity. Which is why verse 6 of Deuteronomy 5 begins with God proclaiming his identity. I am the Lord your God. But then notice the next part of the phrase. Who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. He's saying, you need to remember the story for the story. Remember the story before the story. Because it's very difficult to appreciate the present moment and what is happening if you have no idea what has happened coming before it. And as he goes through the 10 Commandments, this story before the story, the God of Israel, or the God that brought them out of Egypt, is always in the background. And then when you get to chapter 6, which is also a really important text in the Old Testament, the great Shema, it's actually the phrase that Israel would have repeated multiple times a day, every single day. Chapter 6, verse 4, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all of your heart and with all of your soul and with all of your strength. Heard that before? Now notice how God's desire is to saturate them with this law in their present. Verse 6, these commandments that I give you today are to be on your hearts. Impress them on your children. This is going to be a generational thing. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on your door frames of your houses and on your gates. He's saying, saturate yourself in this story. But notice what he says here. In verse 12, leading up to it, he says in chapter 6, he says, you're moving into this new land, this promised land. And then he says this in verse 12, but be careful that you do not forget the Lord who brought you out of Egypt, story before the story, out of the land of slavery, the story before the story. Go down to even verse 20. Listen to how he connects the present moment to the future by reminding them of the past. He says, in the future, when your son asks you, what is the meaning of the stipulations, decrees, and laws the Lord our God has commanded you? You tell him, we were slaves of Pharaoh in Egypt, but the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand. You tell them the story before the story. We do this, As a matter of fact, my kids are, they're coming home from school, and the young ages, they're all so excited. Why? Because they've learned now, the Pledge of Allegiance. They learned now the Star-Spangled Banner. They learned about the stories of Abraham Lincoln and the stories of George Washington and the stories of all the different heroes that were fighting for the different things that make the narrative of America what it is. Here's what's interesting. What is our education system doing? Teaching the children the story before the story. Here's a couple of different things I want to challenge you with this week. Do not presume that you will be able to wisely step into the future if you do not understand the story that comes before the present moment. In order to understand that story, you're going to have to create space. Create space to ask questions of those that have come before you, to hear their story. Create space to study whatever place that God put you in, to study its history and what has happened, because it's fascinating how the stories embed themselves into the very soil of the land that you're living in. You're going to need to create space to sit down and reflect on your own story, of how your parents came together, of how ultimately you received your greatest wounds, and to even reflect on how you've dealt with it as a child, as a young adult, all the way up into the present. As a matter of fact, my challenge for you this week is this: create space to remember the grand story that God has been writing since in the beginning. To remember the located story of the people that are right around you, whether it be your family or your community that you live in. And third, create space to reflect on just the last year of your story. Asking yourself this question: what is flowing into the present? And what is important for me to remember and to know and to reflect on as I take the next step into the future? I love you guys. Have a good week.